Of course I was on mute. I apologize, everyone. My name is Beth Chaplin. I wanted to come on camera briefly just to formally introduce myself to those of you who may not know me. I am the title of the supervisor of Title IV-E with the department. And without delay, let's get this started. Oh, and one more thing, I'm sorry, I did want to interject. The eligibility determination trainers, we have a few that are on today, and they will also be helping with Molly and Melissa to note your questions so that we can follow up with you, because we understand that with FFPSA, there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of questions, and we want to provide as much technical assistance in as timely manner as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my camera off and we can get started with the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, and I'll just double check. Can everyone hear me okay? Can someone from my team let me know?
I can hear you just fine, Beth. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so what we're here to talk about today is the Family First Prevention Services Act, which was signed into law on February 9th of 2018. And it includes the Family First Prevention Services Act. It's part of the larger Family First Public Law 115123. The Family First Prevention Services Act, or FFPSA, as we will more commonly refer to it, amends Title IV-E of the Social Security Act largely to limit Title IV-E foster care maintenance payments on placements in child care institutions. And in Minnesota, the FFPSA requirements for child care institutions began on September 30th. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, Eric, go back one, sorry. I apologize. One of the central goals of FFPSA, as I mentioned in the last slide, is to place limits on claiming Title IV-E in placement settings that are outside of family foster care. And it's really meant to reduce the unnecessary use of congregate care by placing those limits on the Title IV-E foster care maintenance payments for any placement that is not in a family foster home, as well as making certain that placements in congregate care settings have to meet the new standards of FFPSA for a qualified residential treatment setting, which we refer to as QRTP, or other specialized setting type. And I'm going to point this out a few times because there's a couple of things that we just really want to make sure stick. And the limitations that are from FFPSA are regardless of whether or not a child or youth has had previous placements in congregate care in their foster care episode. Any placement after September 30th in one of the specialized settings or a QRTP will be eligible for IV-E claiming if all of the other eligibility requirements are met. Next slide. So just a brief outline of what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover the first 14 days of claiming in both CRFS, so Children's Residential Facilities, as well as FRS, which I know is new to many of you, which refers to foster residence setting. And I'll explain that before we go much further. Then we're going to talk about claiming and eligibility after 14 days. Then we're going to move forward to get into specifics about QRTP requirements, give you a brief bit of information about each of the other specialized setting types, as well as rounding it up with talking about Title IV-E approval process for congregate care facilities, which is done by the department. Next slide. So in federal language, we see the feds refer to child caring institutions. And in Minnesota, we use a different term for that definition. We refer to child care institutions as children's residential facilities, and then now also as foster residence settings, which were formerly referred to as corporate child foster residences. The reason for this change was that federal law changed the definition of family foster care and removed the applicability of foster homes with shift staff and denoted that the foster parent must live in the home. So I have a couple of references here, including the Minnesota statutory reference, as well as the federal statutory reference. I also have a reference to the DHS bulletin that gives more information for foster residence settings. Next slide, please. Okay, so for foster care maintenance payments, we're going to talk about children's residential facilities first. Only the first 14 days of placement are eligible for claiming for foster care maintenance payments upon the initial placement of a child. Now, this is, again, regardless of whether a child has had previous placements in CRFS during their foster care episode. As the same as now, the CRF must be approved for Title IV-E claiming by the department. And for CRFs, that process has not changed. And one thing to note is that the CRF does not need to be one of the specialized setting types for claiming for the first 14 days. They do need to be approved for Title IV-E, but they do not need to be a QRTP, SIL, SEY, and so on. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about foster care maintenance payments for what we are now calling FRSs, or foster residence settings. The first 14 days of placement are eligible for claiming foster care maintenance payments upon the initial placement of the child, only if the following requirements are met. Now, this is different from children's residential facilities. The FRS must be one of the specialized setting types for claiming for the first 14 days. So the foster residence setting, it needs to be be certified for either a QRTP, an SEY, an SIL, a PPY, or an SUD special setting. And we'll talk about what those acronyms mean a little bit further on in the presentation if you are not familiar with those, so don't worry about that. And again, this is going to be regardless of whether or not the child has had a previous placement in other foster residence settings during their foster care episode. And then that middle bullet point that I skipped over, the foster residence setting must now be approved for Title IV-E claiming. Now, it says this process has not changed. It has altered slightly, so just ignore that because I wasn't thinking about it in relationship to a few things when I created this slide. And we will give extensive information on the IV-E approval process for IV-E claiming for both CRS and FRSs a little bit later on in the presentation. Next slide. Okay, so we wanted to talk briefly about what are the FFPSA eligible placement settings that are specialized settings under which you can claim foster care maintenance payments for IV-E beyond the first 14 days. Okay, so the first is a Qualified Residential Treatment Program, or QRTP, a program for prenatal, postpartum, or parenting youth, programs for youth who have been or are at risk for sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation, semi-independent living services supervised for youth 18 and older, and licensed as a residential family-based treatment facility for substance abuse, where children are placed with their parents. Next slide. And this is going to go over those settings types again with a little bit different type of detail. So a QRTP is a setting that is a qualified residential treatment program designed to ensure that children and youth with serious emotional or behavioral disorders or disturbances receive a high level of quality, trauma-informed services. And then the citation is given. The second type is what we refer to as PPY, a setting specializing in providing prenatal, postpartum, or parenting supports for youth. And these facilities must meet the definition of a CCI. And the third type is a setting providing high quality residential care and supportive services to children and youth found to be or at risk of becoming sex trafficking victims as identified by a Title IV agency, which will be a county or tribal local social service agency. And we refer to these program settings as SEY. These facilities must also meet the definition of CCI. Next slide, please. And then we have an SIL, which is a supervised setting in which a youth is living independently, and the federal citation. And then the last setting that we have in our other settings is a SUDS setting, which is a substance use and disorder treatment program. And that is utilized when a child is placed as co-located in a licensed residential family-based substance abuse treatment facility with a parent. And please note that with the SUDS, oh, I'm sorry, go back, Eric. Sorry, I paused for that. Please note that when a child is placed in a SUDS facility co-located with a parent, they must meet all 4E eligibility requirements except for the AFDC means test. Okay, next slide. Now we're going to get into the detail about the different settings types for claiming. So QRTP placements for children and youth have specific requirements, and these requirements must be met in order for Title IV foster care maintenance payments to be claimed. And here are some of the requirements of note. First, there is a 30-day assessment by a qualified individual or a QI, and they must assess the child or youth placed in the QRTP. And let me reiterate that this is what the federal language is. They must assess a child or youth placed in a QRTP within 30 days of initial placement in the QRTP. If the assessment is not completed in the first 30 days, county and tribal agencies cannot claim Title IV foster care maintenance payments. And this is beyond the first 14 days of placement. Now, I do have a note here. I have seen some conflicting information from our federal partners. And so I am seeking confirmation from Region 5 that if the assessment is not done within the 30 days, that the first 14 days are still claimable. I have seen written information otherwise that indicated that if the assessment is not done within the 30 days, that no Title IV-E is available, even for the first 14 days. So as soon as we get that confirmation, we will make sure that that information is shared broadly. And the next is the 60-day court review. A family or juvenile court or another court of competent jurisdiction, including a tribal court or an administrative body appointed or approved by the court independently, must consider an assessment determination and documentation that has been made by the qualified individual in approving the placement. And so there is the same caveat here. We're waiting for federal confirmation so that if the court does not approve a placement within 60 days, that the agency can claim the first 14 days. Next slide. And these are more requirements of QRTPs. Here we're talking about long-term placements. And I won't read the entire thing to you, but what you need to really hone in on is that there needs to be approval by an agency head to continue the placement after the first 12 consecutive months or 18 non-consecutive months of the placement for children that are age 13 or older. If the child has not yet attained the age of 13, it is the first 6 months consecutive or non-consecutive. So again, it's either consecutive 12 months or 18 non-consecutive months for youth 13 and older. And in the case of children that are 12 and younger, this needs to take place within 6 months, whether consecutive or not. And then in transitioning out of a QRTP, counties and tribes may claim IV-E maintenance during the period necessary for the child to transition out of the QRTP. And for the reasons below, the 30-day assessment determines that the QRTP placement is not appropriate, a court disapproves of the QRTP, or the child is going to be returned home, placed with a fit and willing relative, legal guardian, adoptive parent, or family foster home. Next slide. And this is the same information. I just wanted to make sure that it was in here twice to make sure that it was very clear. Next slide. And this is just a visual of what I just described. I thought that this was a great way for those of us that are visual learners to have kind of a cheat sheet that we could utilize for the QRTP placement process timeline. Okay, next slide. Now we're going to talk more about the different other specialized settings types. We sort of talk about QRTP and then the others as the specialized setting types, largely because the requirements for QRTP placements are much different than any requirements for the other specialized settings types. And so we're going to just give a brief window into PPY, SEY, SILS, and SUDS, so SILS and SUDS. And next slide. Okay, and for pregnant and parenting youth, why a specialized setting? Parenting youth and their children should be co-located whenever possible. This is the type of setting that allows that to happen. The individuals that can be served in that setting are pregnant youth expecting fathers, or parenting mothers and fathers?
Hey, Beth,
Yes,
just a note from our policy
Tamara?
expert, Tamara. It's pregnant youth and parenting fathers, not expecting
Expecting fathers.
Okay.
Okay, thank you for that, Tamara. I knew she had made the correction and couldn't find it. So thank you for that, Eric. And we will make sure that that is corrected before the PowerPoint is sent out. So it's pregnant youth and parenting mothers and or fathers. So not expecting fathers. Thank you, Tamara and Eric, for correcting that for me. Next slide. SEY, youth who have been or are at risk of sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation. So these youth have been identified by child welfare as current or previously involved in commercial sexual activity. And it's important to note that there may or may not be a third-party trafficker. Some of the primary risk factors are involvements in other types of exploitation or trafficking, and association with others who exchange sex or anything of value, with secondary risk factors of experiences of abuse, trauma, homelessness, drug use, family conflict, gang affiliation, and more. And it's important for us to always consider intersectionality with social oppression for this group of youth. And I should also note, the person that you can contact for each of these types of settings is listed at the bottom of the page. So Tamara Moore was listed at the bottom of the first slide, and Sarah Ladd is listed on this slide. Okay, and now for supervised independent living setting. This is, as in the title, a supervised living setting for youth in extended foster care. And the setting is going to be a licensed and certified residential setting. So this is not to be confused with supervised independent living that takes place in unlicensed supervised independent living settings where youth live on their own. And the foster care maintenance payment is made directly to or on behalf of the youth. And for example, that would be somewhere like an apartment or a dormitory. And you'll see Nicholas Vogel is listed at the bottom of this page. Okay, and then we have SUDS, which is a substance abuse disorder treatment setting. These are placements in a licensed substance abuse disorder treatment setting where the children are co-located with a parent. The child welfare agency, county or tribal, maintains care and placement responsibility for the child. And now back again to the Title IV eligibility. All of the Title IV-E eligibility requirements apply except for the AFDC mean test requirements. And for questions about SUDS placements, please send them to the DHS Child Safety and Permanency Foster Care email inbox. Okay, and I wanted to slip this slide in there. It is purposefully out of order. I wanted us to revisit again the differences in claiming rules for the CRFS versus the FRSs, which is foster resident setting. And I wanted to provide a clear visual for folks. So as you read, the first row says for the first 14 days does not need to be a QRTP or specialized setting. That is only CRS, that it does not apply to foster resident settings. The second question or second statement is that for the first 14 days must be a QRTP or specialized setting type, and that answer is true for foster resident settings. The third statement is must be approved for Title IV-E claiming by the department. That is true for both settings types. Now, starting on day 15, so after the first 14 days, does not need to be a QRTP or specialized setting type to be eligible for IV-E foster care maintenance payments. You'll see that both of those squares are empty. And that is because the following statement, must be a QRTP or specialized setting type, is true for both children's residential facilities and foster resident settings. And the statement on day 15, the next one is if placement is in a QRTP, all other requirements must be met. That is including the 30-day assessment by the qualified individual, the 60-day assessment and approval by the court, and so on. And you'll see that it's checked for both children's residential facilities and foster resident settings. And then the last statement is the opposite of the previous one. If placement is in a QRTP, no other requirements must be met. And you'll see that that is blank because all of the other requirements must be met. Okay, next slide. Now, one of the things that I know is really important to our county and tribal partners is what happens with the kiddos that were already in placement on September 29th in various facilities that were eligible on the 29th for Title IV-E claiming. We refer to those as legacy placements, excuse me. For children that are in placement before September 30th, those children will remain eligible for Title IV-E claiming for foster care maintenance payments, and we'll refer to those placements as legacy placements. They will remain eligible until that placement ends. So that means it's the continuous placement episode at the same placement location. That's going to include children that were currently placed at both CRFS and foster resident settings as of September 29th. To note is that once a child leaves a legacy placement location, whether it's a CRF or an FRS, that continued placement or any subsequent placement locations are subject to FFPSA. So that includes if a child goes from a legacy placement to a family foster home, or a legacy placement to a different facility. So again, children who were in placement in a congregate care facility on September 29th will remain Title IV-E eligible for foster care maintenance payments as long as they remain in that placement location, and it is part of a continuous placement episode that is continuing from September 29th on. Next slide. Okay, so we have a slide on administrative costs and new placement applicability. FFPSA continues or allows for 50% reimbursement of allowable admin costs for placements in facilities and programs while a child is in the facility or program beyond the first 14 days. That reimbursement is available regardless of whether or not the facility meets any of the federal QRTP or other special setting requirements. Counties and tribes may claim admin costs for the duration of the placements in a QRTP, regardless of whether the requirements in 475A of the Social Security Act, assessment, documentation, and judicial determination requirements for QRTPs are met. And it is specific in that if the requirements in that section are not met, then you can include only administrative costs in 45 Code of Federal Regulations for the admin of the IV-E program and not the cost of the admin and operation of the QRTP. Okay, so this has been a little bit dense information, and we were going to take a break a few slides ago, but I think that this is a good place for us to take a 5-minute comfort break. Is that okay with you, Eric?
That is great.
Okay, so please use the next 5 minutes to use the restroom, stretch, anything you need to do, and we'll be right back.
All right, thanks. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It is 1:40. Glad we provided an opportunity to take a 5-minute break to think about some questions that you might have and digest all of the information that you're learning today. I'm going to hand it back over to our presenters to walk us through the rest of our presentation today. And please continue to ask those valuable questions in the Q&A feature. Thank you.
And this is Beth Chaplin again, and I am in a moment going to turn this over to my colleague, Amber Buckner, to continue the presentation. But there are a few questions that, that I saw in the Q&A that I just want to quickly clarify a few things. And you'll have to accept my apology. I'm still learning some of the language around this, and this is still somewhat new to me. So I apologize if I have not been clear in my presentation at any point. Yes, Title IV-E requirements for the individual child must be met across placement types, including for the first 14 days. The child needs to be Title IV-E eligible, and the placement needs to be IV-E eligible. Now remember, and that's for the entire placement. For the first 14 days, that means both the CRF and the FRS need to be Title IV-E approved. And for the FRS, they need to be one of the specialized setting types or a QRTP. For children's residential facilities, for the first 14 days, they just need to be Title IV-E approved by us here at the department. And in addition, the child needs to meet all IV-E eligibility requirements. And the only setting that has any difference in requirements across all of the other settings types, as well as family foster care, is that for the SUDS placements where a child is co-located with a parent in a substance abuse disorder treatment placement, the AFDC requirements, that needs test, is not required. And that is only for SUD placements. All other placement types, the child must be Title IV-E eligible. And I think that was it. Some of your other questions are being answered by other staff live. We are also taking note of all the questions and will be creating a Q&A document so that we can answer all of your questions, because we understand that with any new program, with any new legislation, any new requirements, there will be a lot of questions. And I also want to mention, and I believe Eric has already mentioned this, and hopefully we'll mention it again at the end of this presentation, there are previous presentations that are available to you through the Minnesota Child Welfare Training system. And they have very specific information on the PPY, the SILS, the SEY. I believe there is a presentation or at least some documents about qualified individuals. So there is a wealth of information that you will be able to find in those previous PowerPoint presentations, webinars, and additional information. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Amber Buckner.
Hello, everyone. Amber Buckner, Title IV-E Child Foster Care Consultant. Just wanted to turn my camera on to introduce myself, and I'll turn my camera off while I present. The process for certification and Title IV-E approval is much the same. DHS licensing will issue certifications and review the requirements for programs facilities licensed by DHS, DOC, counties, and private licensing agencies, which includes the foster residence settings. And the applications for the new FFPSA certifications became available on June 30th, 2021. Programs and facilities choose whether or not to seek these certifications. The programs and facilities may have multiple certifications if the design of the program or facility is appropriate to have more than one of the certified settings. Next slide, please. And there is still a phased process for Title IV-E claiming. Firstly, programs and facilities that are currently eligible for Title IV-E. Reimbursement will become, the programs and facilities currently eligible for Title IV-E reimbursement will need to become certified for one or more of the 4 new settings. When the programs and facilities have received the certification, licensing will notify the Title IV-E staff and no additional information will be needed for the programs or for the facilities to remain Title IV-E eligible. For the programs and facilities, the foster residence settings that are not currently Title IV-E eligible, the programs and facilities are required to obtain the certification from DHS licensing for one or more of the specialized settings. The county submits the following items on behalf of the program or the facility to DHS Financial Operations at fod.facility.financial.forms.dhs@state.mn.us. Next slide, please. So the Title IV-E approval process for CRFS, Children's Residential Facilities. Counties and tribes should send the forms and other items and questions about the process to the FOD email address listed below. And the counties and tribes will send in the notice of contracted per diem rates, which is the DHS Form 2825. And the counties and tribes will send into the FOD email box the Title IV-E checklist, which is the DHS 6634. The counties and tribes will also send in a copy of the license for the facility, as well as a description of the program services that that facility will provide. And the specialized setting forms are attached here. So Eric, if you could please open up the form for QRTP, thank you. I just wanted you to have a visual of what this form looks like, the form that you will be submitting in conjunction to the other forms that you normally send in for your programs and facilities. It's not a long form. It's just a form in conjunction to what you normally would send in when you're seeking Title IV-E approval. And this is the one, Eric will be opening. The next form is for supervised independent living. So this is also much like the other form. It's not very long. It's just a form that you will send in when you're seeking the certification for this particular setting. Next is the form for pregnant and parenting youth. And this form also is not very long at all. And the last one is for sex trafficked youth. This form also is not very long at all. Thank you, Eric. And there is an expedited process in place for the programs and facilities that are currently Title IV-E eligible that have already been certified by one of the national accrediting agencies. Next slide, please. The Title IV-E approval process for the foster residence settings. Though the foster residence settings does not require a lead county contract, the counties will still continue, the counties and the tribes will still continue to send in the forms. And the counties and the tribes will still continue to send in the forms to the FOD email box for foster and for the specialized settings. They'll send it all in to the FOD email box, and they will, the counties and the tribes will still send in the notice of contracted per diem rates. They will still send in the Title IV-E checklist, a copy of the license for the facility, a description of the program services for the facility on behalf of the facility. And this is for foster residence settings. Next slide, please. Here is the foster residence settings rates. And it's a little different because even though the foster residence settings are no longer eligible to receive the North Star reconciliation reimbursement, the foster residence settings will utilize the 3 rates in the North Star care basic rate table below. So here are the rates that the foster residence settings will use going forward based on the ages of the child or the youth. And this again will be available in a copy of the PowerPoint. And Eric, if you could just scroll just a little bit. Okay, great. And it will be listed, I'm sorry, it'll be listed there at the Child Welfare Academy website. And next slide, please. Yes, so everything will be listed here at the Child Welfare Academy training website. And go ahead, Eric. Thank you.
So I just wanted to quickly link ourselves to that website and just kind of go over what Beth and you just talked about. Once you navigate to the Family First Prevention Services Act webpage through the Minnesota Child Welfare Training Academy, our webinars, our pre-recorded webinars have been moved to the top of this page to allow for easier location. So we started with a placement process change webinar on August 5th, and we ended just last week, I believe, or maybe the week before, with that specialized independent living facility that Nick Vogel hosted. We also have additional resources related to the Family First Prevention Services Act. And this webinar that is being recorded right now will also be posted on this website.
And Eric, am I correct in that this is also where the Q&A will be that has taken place during these sessions, where we will be able to post the questions as well as answer them?
That is correct, and that's a great thing to point out. Some of the Q&As have already been vetted and reviewed by Child Safety and Permanency and the foster care unit, and those are placed and marked as Q&A next to each individual webinar. Not all of our webinars will have Q&A, but a good majority of them are, and some of those Q&As are still under review as we speak. So we'll make it a point to announce when those Q&As are posted, or you may take it upon yourself to navigate to this website as time permits to review to see if there's any Q&A follow-up located next to any one of these webinars.
And I would also like to point out that there are some questions that have already been answered. So if you pull up the question and answer box, and I believe that you see the same view as me or similar, but there are some questions where the answer has been typed. So please take a moment to look at those. And again, those will still be part of any Q&A that we produce to add to the website, along with the PowerPoint presentation and the taping of the webinar.
And then here's a list of contact information we have available for individuals. For information regarding residential service requirements, you can contact our foster care unit with this top email handle. For information regarding prevention services requirements, you may contact the safety unit with this email handle. And then for any information related to SSIS that you may not have information to already, please have your reach out to a mentor, or if you are an SSIS coordinator or mentor at your agency, please feel free to funnel those questions through our SSIS help desk through this email handle at the bottom of this slide.
And Eric, Deb Besky-Brown would like to answer one of the questions live during the webinar, if that's okay.
Yes, go for it.
Thank you, Beth and Eric. I appreciate it. There is a question in the chat about explaining the difference between a qualified individual and a professional mental health evaluator. What I'm assuming this is referring to is a mental health professional who is completing a diagnostic and determining the child's mental health diagnosis through that diagnostic process. That is different than the work of the qualified individual when a residential placement is needed. All mental health diagnostic assessments do not determine that residential treatment is needed, nor do they actually approve a residential placement when the county social service agency has placement responsibility. The county social service agency does a juvenile treatment screening team to review the diagnostic completed by the mental health professional. And they then look at that as well as the other services that are available to determine if the child does need out-of-home placement to access the mental health treatment that has been recommended by the mental health professional. The qualified individual will now, after the agency has made the recommendation in the juvenile treatment screening team, the qualified individual will now take that recommendation and review it, completing the CANs and looking at the services that are available and determine that the QRTP is the least restricted setting for the child and make that recommendation. And then that recommendation is reviewed by the court. So they're really two very different things. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you so much, Deb, as always, for providing your insight. I did want to take note of a couple of questions that we have in our Q&A and funnel them over to our subject matter experts in the fiscal under the SSIS Business Operations Unit to provide guidance on right now. And one of those questions is for the FRS, or foster residence setting, formerly the corporate child foster care setting. What codes are used in entering the basic rate into SSIS service arrangements? We are having trouble getting these to work using service code 181. Is there a special cost code that should be used? Will there be training or a job aid soon for the codes to be used for entering these? Molly or Melissa?
Hi, Eric. This is Melissa. Thanks for the question, Marcia. Molly and I are actually putting together a job aid here in the next couple of weeks, we're hoping. The BRASS definition for BRASS 183 is also going to be incorporating the foster residence setting into the definition. So going forward, we are asking you to use BRASS 183 for foster residence setting maintenance payments.
And then a similar follow-up question, will service arrangements and payments need to be split? So first service arrangement / payment is for 14 days. This
This
comes
is-
from Dan.
This is a great question, Dan. Just had again the conversation about this morning. Originally, yes, the payments would need to be split. However, because some of these placements, as we know, we consider them our Rule 5 placements using BRAS 483, do get billed to MA. We need to do some more business requirements regarding the claiming for MA, knowing that SSIS does not allow 2 claims for 1 month because it's considered a duplicative claim. So we're still trying to figure out the business requirements behind that, whether the service arrangements will need to be split for the first 14 days, or if our claiming logic will need to be changed out to allow the duplicate claiming for the month. So more to come with that.
And then to follow up on the question of training or job aids, we definitely will be working together and in conjunction to furnish you with the latest and greatest information related to FFPSA as we move forward. And of course, with changes coming to SSIS in the future release 21.4, we will also be hosting some webinars for those. So stay tuned for ongoing training. And then I'm going to turn it back over to our panelists to address any other questions or close us out for today.
Panelists, were there any other questions that you wanted to answer live? Okay, well, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. We are excited about this journey with Family First Prevention Services Act, and in particular with the difference that this is going to make in the lives of the children and families that we serve. Please make sure that you stay tuned to the Minnesota Child Welfare Training Academy's website for the Q&As that have taken place, or that the questions and answers that we have from all of the various presentations. And we look forward to connecting with you soon as you have questions about implementing this FFPSA. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.